The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Eldoria Palace, as King Alexander stood at his window, watching the gardeners tend to the royal roses. At 68 years old, he had ruled the kingdom of Eldoria for over 2 decades, but lately, the weight of the crown felt heavier than ever. His weathered hands gripped the windowsill as he contemplated the difficult decision that lay ahead. Princess Isabella had been like a daughter to him ever since she married his son Prince William 15 years ago. She had brought grace, intelligence, and genuine warmth to the royal family in ways that had transformed their public image. The people adored her charity work, her natural way with children, and her ability to connect with citizens from all walks of life. But more than that, Alexander had grown to love her as his own child. Queen Victoria, his second wife, stood behind him, adjusting her pearl necklace in the mirror. She had been his companion for 12 years now, stepping into a role that was never easy. The kingdom had loved his first wife, Queen Margaret, who died tragically young in a car accident. Victoria knew she could never fully replace Margaret in the people's hearts, but she had tried to be a good queen and a supportive wife. The ceremony preparations are nearly complete, Victoria said quietly, not looking directly at Alexander. The ancient texts have been studied, and the royal historians confirm that the ritual has not been performed in over 300 years. Alexander turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting the morning light. Are you certain about this, Victoria? Once it begins, there is no turning back. The kingdom will witness something that will change everything. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she continued with her jewelry. Isabella has been chosen by the ancient council. The prophecy speaks of a time when the kingdom faces its greatest challenge, and only through the ritual of succession can the true path be revealed. The signs have all appeared. The white stag in the royal forest, the blooming of the midnight roses, and the discovery of the lost crown jewels in the old castle ruins. The truth was more complex than either of them wanted to admit. Isabella had been experiencing strange dreams for months, visions of ancient queens who had ruled Eldoria centuries ago. In these dreams, she saw herself wearing a crown that had been lost for generations, standing in a hall filled with mystical light. The royal advisors had consulted the old books and determined that Isabella was being called to fulfill an ancient destiny. Meanwhile, Prince William had been struggling with his own burdens. As the heir apparent, he was expected to one day take the throne, but he had privately confided in his father that he felt unprepared for such responsibility. He preferred his work with environmental conservation, and often spoke of wanting to live a simpler life away from the pressures of royalty. The kingdom itself was facing unprecedented challenges. Economic troubles had been mounting, neighboring countries were becoming increasingly aggressive in trade negotiations, and there were rumors of unrest in the outer provinces. The people were losing faith in the traditional ways of governance, and many called for dramatic reforms. It was Princess Isabella who first suggested that perhaps the ancient ways held answers for modern problems. She had been studying the old texts in the royal library, documents that few people had read in centuries. These writings spoke of a ritual where the true ruler could be revealed through divine intervention regardless of bloodline or traditional succession laws. The ritual was known as the bending of the crown, and it required the current monarch to kneel before the chosen one in front of the entire court and the people of the kingdom. It was a ceremony that acknowledged that true leadership came not from birthright alone, but from a calling that transcended earthly hierarchy. And King Alexander had initially dismissed the idea as mere superstition, but as Isabella's visions became more frequent and detailed, and as she began to demonstrate an uncanny understanding of ancient royal protocols she had never studied, even the most skeptical advisors began to take notice. The court historian Professor Edmund Hartwell had spent months verifying the authenticity of the ritual texts. Your Majesty, he had told Alexander just 2 weeks prior, these documents are genuine. They date back to the founding of our kingdom. According to the chronicles, the ritual was last performed during the reign of Queen Arabella the Wise, who used it to choose her successor when she had no heirs. The kingdom prospered for 2 centuries afterward. But Victoria was not convinced by ancient prophecies or mystical visions. She saw the ritual as a threat to her own position and to the natural order of succession. If Isabella were to be crowned through this ancient ceremony, what would become of Prince William's birthright? What would become of her own role as queen? As the weeks passed, the tension in the palace grew. Isabella tried to maintain her normal duties, visiting hospitals and schools, supporting her favorite charities, and raising her own children, Prince James, aged 12, and Princess Sophie, aged 10. But the weight of her supposed destiny was taking its toll. She had grown thinner, more serious, and often seemed to be listening to voices that others could not hear. Prince William watched his wife's transformation with growing concern. He loved Isabella deeply and wanted to support her, but he was also worried about what this ancient ritual might mean for their family. Their children were too young to understand the full implications, but they could sense the unusual tension in the palace. The royal guards had begun reporting strange occurrences around the palace grounds. Lights were seen moving through the gardens at night, though no one could be found when investigated.
The palace cats, normally friendly and social, had begun gathering in the ancient throne room, and would sit for hours staring at the empty throne as if waiting for something. Even the weather seemed to be responding to the approaching ceremony.
Despite it being late autumn, the royal gardens were blooming with flowers that should have been dormant. The fountain in the main courtyard, which had been dry for decades, suddenly began flowing with crystal-clear water, and most remarkably, a family of white deer had appeared on the palace grounds, animals that had not been seen in the kingdom for over 100 years. Queen Victoria found herself unable to sleep most nights. She would walk the halls of the palace, remembering how hard she had worked to earn the respect and acceptance of the people. She had devoted herself to charitable causes, learned the complex protocols of royal life, and always supported Alexander in his decisions as king. Now it seemed that all of her efforts might be swept away by an ancient ritual that she neither understood nor believed in. The palace staff were divided in their opinions. Some of the older servants, who remembered stories told by their grandparents about the old ways, were excited about the possibility of witnessing such a historic ceremony. Others, particularly those who had grown fond of Queen Victoria, worried about what changes might come. Isabella's lady-in-waiting, Maria Santos, had become her closest confidant during this difficult time. Maria had served in the palace for over 20 years and had seen Isabella grow from a nervous young bride into a confident and beloved princess. "Your Highness," Maria had said just the evening before, "whatever happens in this ceremony, you must trust in yourself. The people love you not because of any ancient prophecy, but because of who you are and what you have done for this kingdom." The night before the ceremony, Alexander called together his closest advisors for a final council meeting. The group included Professor Hartwell, General Marcus Thompson, who commanded the Royal Guard, Prime Minister Catherine Reynolds, and Archbishop Daniel Foster, who would oversee the spiritual aspects of the ritual. "Gentlemen, lady," Alexander began, his voice carrying the weight of his years, "tomorrow we embark on something that none of us have ever witnessed. The ancient texts are clear about the procedures, but they cannot tell us what the consequences will be for our kingdom." General Thompson, a practical man who had served the crown for 30 years, expressed his concerns. "Your Majesty, while I respect the traditions of our kingdom, we must consider the security implications. Having the king kneel before anyone, even Princess Isabella, sends a message of vulnerability to our enemies. What if neighboring kingdoms see this as a sign of weakness?" Prime Minister Reynolds nodded in agreement. "There are also constitutional questions, Your Majesty. Our Parliament has not been fully consulted on this matter. Some members are questioning whether an ancient ritual can supersede modern laws of succession. But Archbishop Foster had a different perspective. My friends, we must remember that our kingdom was founded on both earthly wisdom and divine guidance. If Princess Isabella has truly been chosen through means we do not fully understand, then perhaps we are meant to trust in something greater than our own human reasoning." Professor Hartwell spread out several ancient maps and documents on the table. "According to these texts, the ritual must be performed at dawn, in the presence of representatives from every part of the kingdom. The king must wear the crown of his ancestors, and Princess Isabella must be dressed in the ceremonial robes of the ancient queens. The ceremony involves 3 parts: the acknowledgement, the bending, and the recognition." As the meeting continued late into the night, Alexander found himself thinking about his beloved first wife, Queen Margaret. She had always believed in trusting her instincts, even when they went against conventional wisdom. He remembered her saying, "Sometimes the heart sees truths that the mind cannot yet understand." If Margaret were alive today, what would she advise him to do? The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. Tomorrow, in front of the entire kingdom, King Alexander would either participate in the restoration of an ancient and powerful tradition, or he would take part in what could be seen as the undermining of centuries of established royal protocol. Either way, the kingdom of Eldoria would never be the same. The dawn broke crisp and clear over Eldoria Palace, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost supernatural in their beauty. Princess Isabella had not slept at all during the night. Instead, she had spent the hours in meditation and prayer in the small chapel attached to her quarters, seeking guidance for what was to come. Maria Santos arrived at 5 in the morning to help Isabella prepare for the ceremony. The ceremonial robes that had been discovered in the old castle ruins were unlike anything either woman had ever seen, made of deep blue silk that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The fabric was embroidered with silver threads that formed intricate patterns of stars and moons. The dress was clearly ancient, yet it appeared to have been preserved in perfect condition. "Your Highness, you look as if you were born to wear these robes," Maria whispered as she helped Isabella into the elaborate garment. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her, despite being centuries old. Isabella looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The robes transformed her appearance completely, making her look like a figure from a fairy tale or an ancient legend. Her normally light brown hair seemed to have taken on golden highlights overnight, and her green eyes appeared more vivid than ever before. Meanwhile, in the king's chambers, Alexander was going through his own preparations. The crown of his ancestors, which had been brought up from the royal vault, was heavier than the modern crown he usually wore for state occasions. This ancient crown was made of gold and set with gems that had been mined from the mountains of Eldoria over 1,000 years ago. Each stone was said to represent one of the virtues a true ruler must possess: wisdom, courage, justice, compassion, and strength. Queen Victoria had barely spoken to anyone that morning. She sat in her private sitting room, still wearing her nightgown, staring out at the gardens, where hundreds of people were already gathering for the ceremony. Palace staff members moved efficiently through the crowds, setting up viewing areas, and ensuring that representatives from every corner of the kingdom would be able to witness the historic event. The ancient texts required that specific people be present for the ritual to be considered valid. These included members of the royal family, representatives from each of the kingdom's 12 provinces, leaders of the major guilds and trade organizations, high-ranking military officers, religious leaders from all the major faiths practiced in Eldoria, and a group of citizens chosen by lottery to represent the common people. Prince William had spent much of the early morning hours with his children, trying to explain what they were about to witness without frightening them. "Papa, why is Mama wearing those strange clothes?" Young Princess Sophie had asked when she saw her mother in the ceremonial robes. "Sometimes, sweetheart, very old traditions need to be honored," William had replied, though he himself was not entirely sure what to expect from the day's events. "Your mama is doing something very important for our kingdom." Prince James, older and more aware of the implications, had been asking more difficult questions. "Does this mean Mama will be the queen instead of Grandmama Victoria?" he had wondered. William had to admit that he did not know the answer to that question. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the great courtyard of Eldoria Palace filled with people. The ceremony was being broadcast live throughout the kingdom and to neighboring countries. Television crews and newspaper reporters from around the world had gathered to document this unprecedented event. Never before had a reigning monarch performed the ancient ritual of succession in front of such a global audience. The crowd included people from every level of society. Farmers from the rural provinces stood next to wealthy merchants from the capital city. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view, while elderly citizens, who had never expected to witness such history, made sure they had the best seats possible. Archbishop Foster took his position at the center of the courtyard, wearing the ornate ceremonial vestments that had not been used in living memory. The ancient altar, carved from a single piece of white marble, had been brought up from the cathedral basement where it had been stored for centuries. Upon this altar were placed the sacred objects mentioned in the ritual texts: a golden chalice filled with water from the kingdom's oldest spring, a silver bowl containing earth from each of the 12 provinces, and an ancient book bound in leather and written in the old language. At exactly 9 o'clock, the palace bells began to toll, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. The massive oak doors of the palace opened, and King Alexander emerged, wearing the full regalia of his ancestors. The ancient crown caught the sunlight and seemed to send rays of light dancing across the assembled crowd. His ceremonial robes, deep purple velvet trimmed with ermine, swept behind him as he walked slowly toward the altar. The crowd fell completely silent as the king took his position. Every person present understood that they were about to witness something that had not been seen for 300 years. The weight of history hung in the air like a physical presence. Then the palace doors opened again and Princess Isabella appeared. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as they saw her in the ancient ceremonial robes. She moved with a grace and dignity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her normal personality. Her face was serene, almost luminous, and she walked as if guided by an invisible force. As Isabella approached the altar, something extraordinary happened. The white deer that had been seen around the palace grounds suddenly appeared at the edges of the courtyard. They stood perfectly still, as if they too were witnesses to the ceremony. The roses in the royal gardens, which had been blooming unseasonably, seemed to release their fragrance all at once, filling the air with an almost magical sweetness. Archbishop Foster opened the ancient book and began to read in the old language, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. The words, though incomprehensible to most of those present, seemed to resonate with a power that everyone could feel. Even those who considered themselves skeptical of such things found themselves moved by the solemnity of the moment. Professor Hartwell, standing with the other royal advisors, provided quiet translation for those nearby. The ancient text spoke of the divine right of kings, but also of the divine choice of rulers. It acknowledged that sometimes the person best suited to lead a kingdom might not be the one born to the throne, and it provided a sacred mechanism for recognizing such individuals. Queen Victoria watched from a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She could see the faces of the people below, and she recognized the expression of awe and reverence that they wore as they looked at Isabella. It was the same expression she had hoped to see directed at herself during her 12 years as queen. The first part of the ceremony was the acknowledgement. King Alexander was required to recite a formal statement recognizing Princess Isabella's calling and his willingness to participate in the ancient ritual. His voice, usually strong and commanding, seemed to tremble slightly as he spoke the words that had been written centuries ago. Before the eyes of heaven and earth, before the people of this kingdom, and before the spirits of all who have ruled before us, I, Alexander, King of Eldoria, do acknowledge that Princess Isabella has been chosen by forces beyond our earthly understanding. I acknowledge that the signs and portents have appeared as written in the ancient texts. I acknowledge that the time has come for the sacred ritual of succession to be performed. As these words were spoken, a strange phenomenon occurred. Despite the clear morning sky, a single cloud appeared overhead, perfectly positioned to cast a shaft of sunlight directly onto the altar. The light seemed to intensify, creating an almost supernatural illumination that surrounded both the king and Princess Isabella. The second part of the ceremony was the most dramatic and controversial. This was the bending mentioned in the ritual texts. King Alexander, still wearing his crown, was required to kneel before Princess Isabella in front of the entire assembly. For a reigning monarch to kneel before anyone was almost unthinkable in modern times, yet the ancient texts were clear that this was an essential element of the ritual. The silence in the courtyard was so complete that it seemed as if the entire world was holding its breath. King Alexander looked directly into Isabella's eyes, and for a moment those watching could see him wrestling with the magnitude of what he was about to do. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee, then to both knees, his head bowed before the woman who had been chosen by ancient prophecy. The impact of this moment was immediate and overwhelming. Several people in the crowd began to weep, moved by the profound symbolism of the gesture. Others stood with their mouths open in shock, unable to fully process what they were witnessing. The television cameras captured every detail, and around the world, millions of viewers watched in stunned amazement. From her balcony, Queen Victoria felt as if the breath had been knocked from her lungs. Seeing her husband kneeling before another woman, even in a ceremonial context, was more painful than she had anticipated. She understood intellectually that this was about ancient traditions and mystical callings, but emotionally, it felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. Princess Isabella, for her part, seemed almost to be in a trance. She placed her hands gently on King Alexander's shoulders, as specified in the ritual texts, and spoke the words of acceptance that had been written centuries ago. Her voice carried with unusual clarity across the courtyard, as if amplified by some unseen force. The third part of the ceremony was the recognition. This involved the formal acknowledgement by all present that the ritual had been completed and that its spiritual significance was accepted by the kingdom. Archbishop Foster led the assembled crowd in a series of responses, creating a dialogue that bound everyone present into the ancient covenant. As this final portion of the ceremony concluded, several remarkable things happened simultaneously. The white deer that had been standing at the edges of the courtyard suddenly stepped forward, walking calmly through the crowd to approach the altar. They showed no fear of the hundreds of people present, and people stepped aside to let them pass, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. At the same moment, the fountain in the palace courtyard, which had been flowing with clear water since the ancient crown jewels were discovered, began to sparkle and dance as if filled with diamonds. The roses in the royal gardens released another wave of fragrance, and a gentle breeze arose that seemed to carry the scent to every person in the kingdom. But perhaps most remarkably of all, as King Alexander rose from his knees, the ancient crown that he wore seemed to glow with an inner light. The gems set into the gold began to shine with colors that had never been seen before, as if they were being illuminated from within by some mystical energy. The ceremony was complete, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. Princess Isabella had been recognized through the ancient ritual, but what this meant for the future of the kingdom remained to be seen. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, everyone present knew that they had witnessed something that would be remembered for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of the ceremony was unlike anything the palace had ever experienced. Within hours of the ritual's completion, reports began pouring in from across the kingdom of unusual and unexplained phenomena. The drought that had been affecting the eastern provinces suddenly ended as gentle rains began to fall. In the northern mountains, springs that had been dry for decades suddenly began flowing again. Most remarkably, in the capital city's largest hospital, several patients who had been in critical condition showed sudden and unexpected improvements. Princess Isabella, still wearing the ancient ceremonial robes, had retreated to the small chapel in the palace where she had spent the previous night. She needed time to process what had happened and to understand what was expected of her now. The weight of the crown had not yet been placed on her head, but she could feel the responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. King Alexander, meanwhile, found himself in an unprecedented situation. He was still the official monarch of Eldoria, but the ancient ritual had created a spiritual and ceremonial authority that transcended normal royal protocol. He spent the afternoon in meetings with his advisors, trying to determine how to proceed in circumstances that none of them had ever encountered before. The Constitution makes no provision for this situation, Prime Minister Reynolds explained during an emergency cabinet meeting. Legally, you remain the king, your majesty, but the people have witnessed something that goes beyond legal frameworks. We need to find a way to honor both the ancient traditions and our modern system of governance. General Thompson raised practical concerns about security and international relations. Other kingdoms are already sending inquiries about what this means for our alliances and treaties. Some are questioning whether our government is stable if we're making decisions based on ancient prophecies and mystical ceremonies. But Professor Hartwell had been researching similar situations throughout history. There are precedents, though they are rare. In the ancient kingdom of Avaloria, a dual monarchy was established after a similar ritual. The traditional king retained authority over military and diplomatic matters, while the chosen ruler focused on domestic affairs and spiritual guidance for the people. Queen Victoria had locked herself in her private chambers and refused to see anyone except her personal maid. The woman who had spent 12 years building her identity as queen suddenly found herself in a position where her role and relevance were unclear. She had dedicated herself completely to the crown and to supporting Alexander, and now she felt as if everything she had worked for was crumbling around her. Her maid, Eleanor, was one of the few people who truly understood Victoria's pain. "Your Majesty, you must remember that Princess Isabella has always shown you respect and kindness. Whatever changes come, Surely she will honor the contributions you have made to this kingdom. But Victoria's hurt went deeper than concerns about protocol or position. She had married Alexander not just for love, but because she believed they were meant to rule together. She had accepted the burden of being compared to his beloved first wife, Queen Margaret, and had worked tirelessly to earn her own place in the hearts of the people. Now it seemed as if all of her efforts had been meaningless. Throughout the kingdom, the reaction to the ceremony was mixed and intense. In the rural provinces, where old traditions still held strong influence, many people saw the ritual as a return to the kingdom's spiritual roots. Farmers reported that their crops seemed healthier, and shepherds claimed that their animals were calmer and more content since the ceremony. In the more modern urban areas, however, there was significant skepticism and concern. Business leaders worried about economic instability, and younger citizens questioned whether their kingdom was moving backward instead of forward. Protests began to form in the capital city, with some groups demanding a return to purely constitutional monarchy, and others calling for Isabella to be formally crowned as queen. The international community was watching Eldoria closely. The ceremony had been broadcast around the world, and other royal families were uncertain how to respond. Some saw it as a charming return to ancient traditions, while others worried about the precedent it might set for challenging established lines of succession. Prince William found himself caught between his loyalty to his father, his love for his wife, and his concern for his children. He arranged a private meeting with Isabella to discuss what the ceremony meant for their family and their future. "Isabella, I need to understand what you're experiencing," he said as they walked together in the palace gardens. "Are you different now? Do you feel changed by what happened during the ritual?" Isabella paused by the fountain, which was still flowing with the crystal-clear water that had appeared mysteriously weeks ago. "William, I wish I could explain it in a way that would make sense to you. During the ceremony, it was as if I could see the entire history of our kingdom laid out before me. I could feel the presence of every ruler who had come before, and I understood connections between past events and current challenges that I had never seen before." She touched the water in the fountain, and it seemed to sparkle more brightly at her touch. "I don't feel like a different person exactly, but I do feel as if I've been given access to knowledge and understanding that I didn't have before. It's both wonderful and terrifying." William took her hand gently. "What does this mean for us? For James and Sophie? Are you still my wife, or have you become something else entirely?" Isabella smiled for the first time since the ceremony. "I will always be your wife and the mother of our children. Whatever role I'm meant to play in the kingdom's future, that won't change. But I think we need to be prepared for our lives to be very different from what we expected." As news of the ceremony spread throughout the world, scholars and historians began studying the ancient texts that had guided the ritual. Religious leaders debated the spiritual implications of what had occurred, while political scientists tried to analyze the potential consequences for modern monarchy. In the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, King Richard III called an emergency meeting with his advisors. "What happened in Eldoria today challenges everything we understand about royal succession and divine right," he told his council. "If ancient rituals can supersede bloodline inheritance, what does that mean for the stability of all our kingdoms?" Queen Marie of Valeria, who had always been friendly with both Alexander and Isabella, sent a private message expressing her support but also her confusion. "I have witnessed many royal ceremonies in my lifetime," she wrote, "but I have never seen anything like what occurred in your kingdom today. Please know that Valeria stands ready to support Eldoria through whatever changes may come." Back in Eldoria, the evening brought new developments. As the sun set, the white deer that had appeared during the ceremony remained on the palace grounds, settling peacefully in the gardens, as if they intended to stay permanently. The palace gardeners reported that wherever the deer had walked, the grass seemed greener and flowers bloomed more vibrantly. Isabella, still wearing the ancient robes because she felt reluctant to remove them, met with Archbishop Foster to discuss the spiritual aspects of what had occurred. "Your Highness, in all my years of religious study, I have never experienced anything like what happened during today's ceremony," the Archbishop admitted. "The presence that filled the courtyard was unlike anything in my theological training." "I felt it too," Isabella replied. "It was as if the very air was alive with energy and purpose." "Father, what do you think it means? What am I supposed to do with this calling that I apparently have received?" The Archbishop consulted the ancient texts that had guided the ritual. According to these documents, those chosen through this ceremony are meant to serve as bridges between the earthly concerns of governance and the spiritual needs of the people. You are called to be both a practical leader and a spiritual guide. Meanwhile, King Alexander was struggling with his own identity crisis. For over 20 years, he had been the unquestioned authority in his kingdom. Now, while he retained his official position, he found himself deferring to Isabella's insights on matters where she seemed to have gained supernatural understanding. During a late-night strategy session about how to respond to the economic challenges facing the kingdom, Isabella had suggested solutions that came to her as if through inspiration rather than analysis. Her ideas were unconventional but seemed to address root causes of problems that traditional approaches had failed to solve. Perhaps, she had said, we've been thinking about economic growth in terms of competing with other kingdoms, when we should be focusing on creating sustainable abundance within our own borders. What if we redesigned our trade policies to prioritize long-term prosperity for our people rather than short-term gains for the treasury? Alexander found himself nodding in agreement, even though these ideas contradicted everything his economic advisors had been telling him for years. There was something about Isabella's perspective that felt both ancient and innovative at the same time. The palace staff were also adapting to the changes in their daily routines. The ancient ceremonial robes that Isabella continued to wear required special care, and the crown jewels that had been discovered in the castle ruins needed to be properly catalogued and secured. Most significantly, the small chapel where Isabella had spent the night before the ceremony had become a place where palace workers and local citizens came to pray and seek guidance. Queen Victoria finally emerged from her chambers as night fell, but she was clearly struggling with the new dynamic in the palace. At dinner, which was the first meal the royal family had shared since the ceremony, the tension was palpable. "I suppose we need to discuss practical matters," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled. "If Isabella is to take on this new role, how do we manage the transition? What happens to the duties and responsibilities that I have been handling?" Isabella, who had finally changed out of the ceremonial robes and into more normal attire, reached across the table to take Victoria's hand. "Victoria, nothing about today's ceremony was meant to diminish what you have contributed to this kingdom. You have been a wonderful queen, and your dedication to charitable causes and diplomatic relations has made a real difference in people's lives." But Victoria pulled her hand away. "Isabella, I appreciate your kindness, but we both know that everything has changed. The people saw Alexander kneel before you today. They heard the ancient words spoken and witnessed signs and wonders. How can I continue to call myself queen when you have been chosen by forces beyond our understanding?" Prince William tried to mediate the conversation. "Perhaps we can find a way for both of you to serve the kingdom in ways that honor your different strengths and callings. This doesn't have to be a situation where someone wins and someone loses." King Alexander, who had been quiet throughout most of the meal, finally spoke. "Victoria, I need you to know that my participation in today's ceremony was not a rejection of you or of our marriage. It was an acknowledgement of something larger than our personal relationships. The kingdom needed this ritual, even if we don't fully understand why." As the evening progressed, it became clear that the ancient ceremony had set in motion changes that would reshape not just the royal family, but the entire kingdom of Eldoria. The challenge now was to navigate these changes in a way that honored both ancient wisdom and modern needs, while keeping the kingdom united and strong in an uncertain world. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the kingdom of Eldoria was experiencing changes that no one could have predicted. The initial skepticism from urban areas had begun to give way to curiosity as people witnessed the practical results of Isabella's new role. The innovative economic policies she had suggested were already showing promising results, with small businesses reporting increased prosperity and unemployment rates beginning to decline. Isabella had established what she called wisdom councils in each of the 12 provinces, bringing together representatives from different walks of life to address local challenges. These councils operated differently from traditional government committees, focusing on finding solutions that considered both immediate needs and long-term consequences for future generations. In the province of Millbrook, a farming region that had been struggling with soil depletion, Isabella's council had implemented an ancient crop rotation system that had been found in old agricultural texts. The farmers had been skeptical at first, but after just 3 weeks they were reporting healthier soil and stronger plant growth than they had seen in years. Similarly, in the coastal province of Seahaven, where fishing communities had been dealing with declining catches, the Wisdom Council had developed new fishing practices based on tidal patterns and seasonal cycles that were described in old maritime records. The fishermen who tried these methods found their nets fuller than they had been in months. But not all changes were welcome or easy to accept. Queen Victoria had been struggling to find her place in the new order, and her pain was becoming increasingly visible to those around her. She had always prided herself on being dignified and composed, but the strain was beginning to show. She had lost weight, rarely smiled, and often seemed lost in her own thoughts. The breaking point came during a state dinner with visiting diplomats from the Kingdom of Meridia. Isabella, wearing a modern gown but with the ancient crown that had been discovered in the castle ruins, moved through the reception with a grace and authority that impressed the foreign guests. She discussed trade agreements with an understanding of economic principles that seemed to come from sources beyond her formal education, and she addressed diplomatic concerns with wisdom that surprised even King Alexander. Queen Victoria, dressed in her finest jewelry and most elegant dress, found herself largely ignored by the visiting dignitaries. They were all eager to speak with Isabella, to understand this mysterious princess who had been chosen through ancient ritual, and who seemed to possess almost supernatural insights into governance and leadership. After the dinner, Victoria confronted Alexander in their private sitting room. "I cannot continue living like this," she said, tears streaming down her face for the first time since anyone could remember. "I feel like a ghost in my own palace. The servants look at me with pity, the visiting dignitaries barely acknowledge my presence, and you spend more time consulting with Isabella than you do speaking with your own wife." Alexander tried to comfort her, but his words felt hollow even to himself. "Victoria, you are still my wife and still the queen. That will never change." "But it has already changed," Victoria replied, her voice breaking. "Everyone can see that Isabella is the real power now. The people look to her for guidance. Foreign leaders want to understand her methods, and even our own children prefer to take their problems to her rather than to us." This last comment stung because it was partially true. Prince James and Princess Sophie had been fascinated by their mother's transformation and had begun spending more time with Isabella, asking questions about the ancient texts and the visions she had experienced. They sensed that something important had happened, and their natural curiosity drew them to the person who seemed to understand these mysteries. The conversation between Alexander and Victoria was interrupted by urgent knocking at their door. General Thompson entered, looking more serious than anyone had seen him in years. "Your Majesties, we have a crisis situation. The Kingdom of Draconia has moved troops to our eastern border. King Reginald is claiming that Eldoria's government is no longer legitimate because our succession laws have been compromised by ancient rituals and superstitious practices." Alexander felt his blood run cold. He had worried that the ceremony might be seen as a sign of weakness by their neighbors, but he had hoped that their long-standing peace treaties would prevent any aggressive actions. "How many troops, General?" Alexander asked, immediately shifting into his role as military commander. "Approximately 10,000 soldiers, Your Majesty. They're positioned just outside our border town of Eastgate. King Reginald has sent a message demanding that we renounce the ancient ceremony and return to traditional monarchy, or he will consider our kingdom to be in a state of internal collapse that threatens regional stability." Victoria looked at her husband with an expression that clearly said, "I told you so," but she remained silent. Alexander called for an immediate council meeting with all of his military and diplomatic advisors. As news of the military threat spread through the palace, Isabella was meditating in the chapel, seeking guidance about how to respond to this challenge. The ancient texts that had guided the succession ceremony also contained references to times when the chosen ruler would be tested by external threats. According to these documents, such tests were not merely military or political challenges, but spiritual trials that would reveal whether the person chosen through the ritual truly possessed the wisdom and strength to protect the kingdom. The texts suggested that conventional military responses might not be sufficient, and that the chosen ruler might need to rely on unconventional methods. When Isabella joined the emergency council meeting, she brought with her several books from the royal library that she had been studying. The ancient texts speak of times when kingdoms face threats that cannot be resolved through traditional warfare, she told the assembled advisors. They suggest that sometimes the greatest strength comes from apparent vulnerability, and the most effective defense comes from unexpected approaches. General Thompson, A practical military man was clearly skeptical. "Your Highness, with respect, we are facing 10,000 trained soldiers with modern weapons. Ancient texts cannot stop tanks and artillery." But Isabella had a different perspective. "General, what if we invited King Reginald to come to Eldoria and witness our kingdom firsthand? Let him see that our people are prospering, that our government is stable, and that our changes have made us stronger, not weaker." Prime Minister Reynolds looked shocked. "Your Highness, that would be incredibly risky. If King Reginald enters our territory with hostile intent, he could gather intelligence about our defenses or even attempt to take you and the royal family hostage." Yes, there would be risks, but according to the ancient texts, there are times when taking calculated risks based on spiritual guidance can achieve results that military force cannot. King Reginald is challenging our legitimacy, so let us prove our legitimacy by demonstrating the strength and prosperity of our kingdom. King Alexander found himself torn between his military training, which told him to prepare for conventional warfare, and his growing trust in Isabella's unconventional insights. The success of her domestic policies had shown that her seemingly impossible ideas sometimes produced remarkable results. "Isabella, if we follow your suggestion and it fails, we could be handing our entire kingdom over to King Reginald," Alexander pointed out. "And if we respond with military force, we could be starting a war that will bring suffering to innocent people in both our kingdoms," Isabella replied. "The ancient texts suggest that there is a third option, a path that transforms enemies into allies through demonstration of wisdom and strength." Archbishop Foster, who had become one of Isabella's most trusted advisors, supported her approach. "Your Majesties, I have been studying the historical accounts of similar situations. In many cases, rulers who relied on spiritual guidance rather than military force found solutions that exceeded what anyone thought possible." The debate continued through the night, with various advisors arguing for different approaches. General Thompson advocated for mobilizing their army and requesting military support from allied kingdoms. Prime Minister Reynolds preferred diplomatic negotiations through traditional channels. Professor Hartwell suggested researching historical precedents for similar situations. But Isabella remained convinced that the answer lay in the ancient texts and in trusting the same spiritual guidance that had led to the succession ceremony. "I believe that King Reginald is not our true enemy," she said. "According to the texts, challenges like this often arise when kingdoms are being prepared for larger purposes. Perhaps King Reginald's aggression is a test that we must pass in order to demonstrate that our changes have made us truly stronger." As dawn approached, a messenger arrived with additional news from the border. King Reginald's forces were not just positioned defensively, they were actively preparing for invasion. Artillery had been moved into position, and supply lines were being established for what appeared to be a prolonged military campaign. Queen Victoria, who had remained silent for most of the night's discussions, finally spoke. "Perhaps this crisis will help us all remember the importance of proven traditional methods of governance. If we had not performed that ancient ceremony, we would not be facing this threat to begin with." Her words stung not because they were unkind, but because they expressed doubts that several of the advisors were also feeling privately. Had the succession ceremony really strengthened the kingdom, or had it made them vulnerable to exactly this kind of challenge? Isabella, however, remained calm and focused. "Victoria raises an important point about tradition and proven methods," she acknowledged. "But the ancient texts remind us that sometimes what appears to be tradition is actually fear of change, and what appears to be proven is actually reluctance to grow." She opened one of the old books she had brought to the meeting. "There is a passage here that speaks of times when kingdoms must choose between the safety of staying the same and the risk of becoming what they are meant to be. It suggests that external threats often arise precisely when internal transformations are most needed." King Alexander realized that they had reached a point where they had to make a fundamental choice about the future direction of their kingdom. They could abandon the path they had started with the succession ceremony and return to traditional methods, or they could trust in the guidance that had led them this far and continue forward despite the risks. The decision would not just determine how they responded to King Reginald's threat, but would shape the identity and destiny of Eldoria for generations to come. As the sun rose over the palace, casting long shadows across the council chamber, everyone present understood that they were facing a moment that would define who they really were as a kingdom and as a people. Outside the palace windows, the white deer that had remained on the ground since the ceremony could be seen standing peacefully in the gardens, as if waiting to see what choice the humans would make. The decision was made at sunrise. After hours of debate, King Alexander chose to trust Isabella's unconventional approach, despite the enormous risks involved. A formal invitation was sent to King Reginald, requesting that he come to Eldoria as a guest for 3 days to observe the kingdom's condition and governance firsthand, before making any final decisions about military action. The response came back within hours, surprising everyone with its acceptance. King Reginald agreed to visit, but insisted on bringing a substantial security detail, and warned that his army would remain positioned at the border, ready to act if he determined that Eldoria posed a threat to regional stability. Isabella spent the next 2 days in intensive preparation, not for military defense, but for what she described as demonstration of truth. She worked with the wisdom councils from all 12 provinces to identify the most compelling examples of positive changes that had occurred since the ancient ceremony. She also spent hours studying the historical texts to understand the deeper purpose behind King Reginald's challenge. According to the ancient writings, she explained to Alexander and the royal council, external threats like this often serve as catalysts for kingdoms to discover their true strength and purpose. King Reginald may believe he is challenging our legitimacy, but perhaps he is actually helping us prove to ourselves and to the world what we have become. Queen Victoria watched these preparations with a mixture of admiration and resentment. She could see that Isabella was approaching this crisis with remarkable wisdom and confidence, but she also felt increasingly marginalized, as everyone looked to Isabella for guidance instead of to her, or even to King Alexander. The morning of King Reginald's arrival, the palace was filled with nervous energy. Palace guards had been positioned throughout the grounds, but they were instructed to remain as unobtrusive as possible. Instead of a show of military strength, Isabella wanted to create an atmosphere of peaceful prosperity and confidence. King Reginald arrived with a convoy of vehicles carrying 40 armed soldiers and several military advisors. He was a tall, stern man in his 50s, with gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had ruled Draconia for 15 years, through strict military discipline and traditional royal protocols, and he clearly viewed Eldoria's recent changes with deep suspicion. The initial reception in the palace throne room was formal and tense. King Alexander, wearing his traditional royal regalia, greeted his neighboring monarch with appropriate diplomatic courtesy. Queen Victoria, dressed in her most impressive jewels, stood beside him with perfect posture and a carefully neutral expression. But all eyes were on Princess Isabella, who entered the throne room wearing the ancient ceremonial robes from the succession ceremony. The sight of her caused a visible reaction among King Reginald's advisors, some of whom whispered among themselves with obvious concern. King Reginald studied Isabella carefully before speaking. "So you are the woman who has convinced an entire kingdom to abandon centuries of established tradition in favor of ancient superstitions and mystical ceremonies." Isabella met his gaze calmly. "Your Majesty, I am someone who has been chosen to serve this kingdom in ways that I am still learning to understand. I would be honored to show you what has resulted from our return to ancient wisdom." The first stop on Isabella's carefully planned tour was the province of Millbrook, where the farming communities had implemented the old agricultural methods. King Reginald's agricultural advisors examined the fields and spoke with local farmers, expecting to find evidence of declining productivity or unsustainable practices. Instead, they found crops that were healthier and more abundant than anything in the region had produced in decades. The soil, which had been depleted from years of intensive farming, showed clear signs of restoration. The farmers spoke enthusiastically about techniques they had learned from ancient texts, methods that worked in harmony with natural cycles rather than against them. "This is impossible," muttered one of King Reginald's advisors. "These yields should not be achievable with such simple methods." Isabella overheard the comment and smiled gently. "Perhaps the impossible becomes possible when we remember wisdom that we had forgotten. Our ancestors understood things about the relationship between land and crops that modern agriculture has lost." The second stop was the coastal province of Seahaven, where the fishing communities demonstrated their new methods based on ancient maritime knowledge. King Reginald, who prided himself on understanding naval and maritime affairs, watched in amazement as local fishermen brought in catches that exceeded anything they had achieved using modern techniques. "How long have you been using these methods?" he asked the lead fisherman. "Only 3 weeks, Your Majesty," the man replied. "Princess Isabella brought us old books that our grandfathers' grandfathers might have known, but we had forgotten. The sea has been more generous to us than it has been in years." King Reginald began to look troubled. He had come to Eldoria expecting to find a kingdom weakened by superstition and poor leadership. Instead, he was seeing evidence of prosperity and innovation that challenged his assumptions about effective governance. The third stop was the capital city, where Isabella had established new programs for addressing poverty and unemployment. Instead of traditional welfare systems, she had created community networks that connected people with different skills and needs, allowing them to support each other in ways that built long-term prosperity rather than dependence. King Reginald spoke privately with several citizens who were participating in these programs. To his surprise, they spoke not just of receiving help, but of finding purpose and dignity in ways that traditional government assistance had never provided. That evening, a state dinner was held at the palace, but it was unlike any diplomatic meal King Reginald had ever attended. Instead of formal speeches and political discussions, Isabella had arranged for representatives from each province to share stories about the positive changes in their communities. As the evening progressed, something unexpected began to happen. King Reginald started asking genuine questions instead of skeptical challenges. He wanted to understand how these changes had been achieved so quickly, and how ancient texts had provided solutions to modern problems. Isabella answered his questions with patience and detail, sharing insights from the old books and explaining how they had adapted historical methods to current needs. She spoke about the importance of recognizing that wisdom was not limited to modern knowledge, and that sometimes the oldest solutions were the most sustainable. "But surely," King Reginald said, "these methods cannot address serious challenges like economic competition with other kingdoms, or defense against military threats, or complex international diplomacy." Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "You raise important concerns, Your Majesty. The ancient texts do not ignore such challenges. They suggest that kingdoms become truly strong not through competition and conflict, but through developing internal prosperity and wisdom that makes them valuable allies, rather than threatening enemies." She gestured to the representatives from the various provinces who were seated around the dinner table. "Our people are healthier, more prosperous, and more united than they have been in years. This makes us a more reliable trading partner, a more trustworthy ally, and actually a more formidable opponent if threatened, because our citizens have reasons to defend what they have built together." King Reginald was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing what he had observed throughout the day. Finally, he turned to King Alexander. "I came here prepared to demonstrate that your kingdom had become unstable and unreliable. Instead, I find evidence of the kind of prosperity and unity that most kingdoms struggle to achieve through conventional methods." King Alexander felt a surge of pride and relief. "Your Majesty, we took enormous risks in following this path. I will not pretend that we understood all the consequences when we began, but the results speak for themselves." "Indeed they do," King Reginald replied, then turned his attention back to Isabella. "Princess, I must ask you directly. Do you believe that these ancient methods could be adapted to other kingdoms, or are they specific to Eldoria's unique circumstances?" Isabella considered the question carefully. The texts suggest that each kingdom must find its own path to wisdom and prosperity, but that the underlying principles are universal. The specific methods might vary, but the importance of balancing ancient wisdom with current needs appears to be something that all peoples can benefit from. Queen Victoria had been silent throughout most of the dinner, but now she spoke with quiet dignity. "King Reginald, I hope you can see that Princess Isabella's role in our kingdom has not weakened our traditional structures, but has strengthened them by adding new dimensions of understanding and capability." It was a gracious statement that surprised everyone, including Victoria herself. Despite her personal pain and sense of displacement, she recognized the importance of presenting a united front to their foreign guest, and she could see that Isabella's methods were genuinely benefiting their people. On the second day of his visit, King Reginald requested private meetings with various palace staff, local merchants, and citizens chosen randomly from the capital city. He wanted to verify that what he had been shown was representative of the kingdom's true condition, not carefully staged propaganda. To his amazement, everyone he spoke with confirmed the positive changes that had occurred since the succession ceremony. More importantly, they spoke with genuine enthusiasm and hope about their future, something that King Reginald rarely encountered in his own kingdom despite its military strength and economic stability. That afternoon, King Reginald asked for a private conversation with Isabella in the palace gardens, away from advisors and formal protocol. They walked among the roses that had been blooming unseasonably since the ancient crown jewels were discovered, accompanied only by the white deer that had become permanent residents of the palace grounds. "Princess Isabella, I must confess that you have challenged many of my assumptions about effective leadership and governance," King Reginald said as they paused by the fountain that continued to flow with crystal-clear water. "I came here believing that your kingdom had been weakened by abandoning proven methods in favor of mystical practices. Instead, I find that you have discovered something that has made your kingdom stronger than mine in many important ways." Isabella touched the water in the fountain, and, as always, it seemed to sparkle more brightly at her contact. "Your Majesty, I believe that every kingdom has access to the same sources of wisdom and strength. The ancient texts are not unique to Eldoria. Similar knowledge exists in the histories and traditions of all peoples, but we have learned to dismiss such things as outdated or impractical." King Reginald watched the white deer grazing peacefully nearby, animals that had not been seen in the wild for generations, but now lived contentedly on the palace grounds. "If what you say is true, then perhaps I have been governing through fear and control when I could have been leading through wisdom and inspiration." "Fear and control have their place," Isabella replied diplomatically, "but they are tools for managing problems, not for creating prosperity and happiness. The ancient texts suggest that true leadership involves helping people discover their own capacity for wisdom and contribution." On the final day of his visit, King Reginald made an announcement that stunned everyone present. Instead of declaring Eldoria a threat to regional stability, he formally requested that Isabella visit Draconia as a consultant to help his kingdom explore similar approaches to governance. "I have seen enough to convince me that Princess Isabella possesses insights that could benefit not just Eldoria, but all the kingdoms in our region," he declared during a formal ceremony in the palace courtyard. "Instead of viewing these changes as a threat, I choose to see them as an opportunity for all of us to learn and grow." King Alexander felt tears of relief and gratitude streaming down his face as he watched his former enemy kneel before Isabella, not in the ancient ritual of succession, but in a gesture of respect and recognition of her wisdom. Queen Victoria stood beside her husband, and for the first time since the original ceremony, she smiled genuinely. She was beginning to understand that Isabella's role was not about replacing anyone or diminishing anyone else's contributions, but about expanding the kingdom's capacity to serve its people and contribute to the larger world. As King Reginald's convoy departed, taking with them copies of the ancient texts and plans for future collaboration, everyone present understood that they had witnessed the transformation of a potential war into the beginning of a new alliance. The white deer gathered at the palace gates as if to bid farewell to the visiting monarch, and the gardens released their sweetest fragrance into the afternoon air. Princess Isabella, still wearing the ancient robes that had become a symbol of Eldoria's new path, stood with the royal family watching their former enemy depart as a new friend. The succession ceremony that had begun with King Alexander falling to his knees had led not to the destruction of traditional monarchy, but to its transformation into something more wise, more prosperous, and more peaceful than anyone had dared to imagine. In the weeks that followed, delegations from other kingdoms began arriving in Eldoria, all seeking to understand the methods that had produced such remarkable results. Isabella found herself becoming not just the spiritual leader of her own kingdom, but a teacher and guide for rulers throughout the known world. The ancient wisdom that had been preserved in forgotten texts was beginning to spread, offering hope that the age of conflict and scarcity could be replaced by an age of cooperation and abundance.